Good morning, it's Kim from the Shamrock Quilt Studio, and today we're working on our final block of the month, and this is for the month of January. If you recall, when we started this, we started with the February block, so we've got that 1 month to catch up on. And January is cold just about everywhere, and a lot of places they have snow in January. So our theme for this month's block of the month is a snowflake. Join us right after this and I'll show you how I made it. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hi there, and we're working on our January block of the month, and this one is going to be really cute, I think. Now, my inspiration from this came from Pinterest, and there were a couple of different sources that showed different designs similar to this, and I'll link a couple below if I can find the information for it. But basically, it's a snowflake made the same way that the Dresden plates are made, and that's why I hung this quilt back up on the wall, so that you can have a reminder of how these Dresden plate fans work, or blades work, and how they go together to make a plate. And we're going to use that same philosophy to make this design. Now, the actual pieces and the size and shape of those pieces are my own generally, but the general design did come from other places, just so we're clear on that. So what I did was I checked my stash, and I was looking for 3 different shades of blue for the snowflake. So I found these. One is kind of a medium dark, a medium, and a light, and they all have a little pattern in them, and they seem to play well off of each other. They look soft, they look cold, they look like they go together, and they can play off of each other in the tones. Now, the second issue that I had with this design, I knew how theoretically it was going to be constructed, just like a Dresden plate, but a snowflake is 6 pieces, and a lot of times these Dresden plates are 4 pieces. If you'll notice in this one, there are 4 blades with the pointy. So a lot of times they're divided up in quarters. And now we need to take that design with a quarter and make it into a 6 sectioned plate, so to speak. And looking at the pictures that I saw on Pinterest, there were varying heights of these blades. So the first thing I did was look at a typical pattern for a Dresden blade, and they're a simple design. They're flat across the top, and when you fold that and sew it, you get a point. And then the 2 lines coming down include your seam allowance, and when they are sewn together, they give you that blade shape. Now, for a Dresden with 4 quarters, that was my iron telling me it's ready. It's going to be a lot bigger, a lot wider than this Dresden we're making. So I did a little math, and this is going to look a little crazy to you, but this is kind of how I started thinking about how we needed to derive some type of pattern to make this. So I started thinking about that circle we're making all the way around, and the circle is 360 degrees. And we're having 6 sections, and I wanted each section to be a long blade with 2 medium blades in between, and then a smaller blade separating those sections. So in total, it was going to have 24 pieces. So I took the 360 divided by 24 and got a 15 degree angle, which is what we needed to work with. And wouldn't you know it, I found a compass, which I can never usually find, but I couldn't find a protractor. So what I had to rely on was a regular quilting ruler, because each of these quilting rulers have some diagonal lines printed on them, and they have a 60 and they have a 30. So if you're looking to make 15-degree angles, you can start with that 60 or that 30 to get to the 15. Now that's a lot of math, and I was a little surprised, or reminded, I probably would be a better term, of how much we use geometry when we're working on things like this. So if you're interested in knowing how I got to that from a mathematical perspective, I'd be happy to share that with you. But we're going to focus today on the pattern. So what I did was I took and drew up 15-degree angles and then added a seam allowance to each side, and then topped each one off. And let me tell you how big these are. From the point, the biggest one is 6.5 inches from the tip of the point to the flat edge up top. The medium size is 5.5, and the little one is 4.5. Try to keep it even and simple with whole numbers there for a 1-inch difference. And then I cut 6 of the big ones out of my lightest fabric. I cut 6 of the tiniest ones out of my darkest fabric. And then the medium size blade, I cut 12, because you'll need one of these on each side of that light large blade. And then I cut them out the same way you do for Dresdens. And I'm going to sew them together almost the same way. The difference is that when you lay out these pieces, let me pull these over, there needs to be a difference of where they're placed. Now the points are all together here, but I'm measuring here for the distance. And for each step, it's 1 inch from the tip of the biggest one to the tip of the medium-sized one. And from the tip of the medium-sized one to the smallest one, it's 1 inch. So that kept it really even and easy to figure out where they needed to be placed. And then I pinned them, and then we're just going to sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, it doesn't really matter whether you start, excuse me, from the bottom or from the top. I prefer to start from the top because that gives me the opportunity to backspace. Whoops, that's not the right seam allowance. Okay, good. We got that corrected before we had a problem. And I'm just going to sew straight down that one side. Whoops, and that went askew on the end, but let's see how far out we are. Yeah, we may need to fix that. I was going to tell you that if you start from the top and sew to the bottom, don't backspace at the bottom, because once you get all the pieces in place, if you have to adjust, that's where you're going to probably need to adjust. Okay, and I think what happened is the little pin I had in there got caught and it pulled the fabric around. Okay, there's one, and let's do this other one. And this one we're going to be sewing from the bottom to the top. So we'll just start stitching. And as we get to the top, we'll do a little backspace. And you can sew all the way out to the end of the longest one if you'd like. That may help you with your pressing. Rolling pins and stuff today. All right, so we've sewn that one together and we've sewn this one together. Now what I found worked best was in pressing these was to press the darkest one out this way. So the darkest one is going to lay flat, pressing the seams to the middle size and fabric. And that's different than we typically would do, but we're trying to make all of these lay flat with them, with their pieces. So now this is the middle size, and the middle size we had it lay flat on one side of each of them. And I think you'll be able to tell this a little bit better when you start working, because as you sew more and more of them together, you're going to be sewing, in some cases, not only sewing that new piece onto it, but you're going to be sewing through several layers of fabric for what you already have. Now, if we've sewn those right, they should fit right together. So here's what we have. And then this would go here, and this would go here. So we're going to sew these two together. We're going to make sure that we've got our measurements correct here. This is an inch difference, and that is correct. Whoops, I measured the wrong one. We're going to just double check this, because when you get down to the last one, they have to go together correctly so they all match up. And that's correct. Let me sew that one really quick, or iron it, and we'll put it together. Now I will tell you a couple of things about this that you probably should know. You've got a lot of pieces of fabric, and every time you add a new seam allowance, there's an opportunity to be off on that seam allowance. There's an opportunity for your stitching not to be right. And frankly, it's going to be a little difficult to get all of those pieces in there and matched up. But just be patient. I did have one seam that I had to adjust. I had one of the smaller pieces that either wasn't cut correctly to begin with, and it was wider at the base or the middle of it. And I don't know if it was actually cut too big and that's what caused the problem, or if when it was sewn it stretched out, because a lot of these cuts are on bias or close to bias because of the way they're cut. Okay, now that's going to go together nicely. Let me show you. I think you can see in the overhead how that's going to go together. So we just need those to go together. And the other thing I'll tell you is press as you go, because there's a lot of seams here and they're very narrow, and it's going to be hard to press it after the fact if you've not pressed it as you go. So we're going to sew these two seams together. We're going to use the same technique. We want an inch difference because we do want them to be consistent. They don't need to be perfect, but consistent would be good. And then match up the seam along the edge. I'm going to go ahead and put one down here at the bottom. So what I was talking about before about sewing through different layers, when you sew this, and if you start here and sew down, by the time you get down to here, you'll not only be sewing these two pieces of fabric together, but you'll be sewing this dark blue piece of fabric together and a piece of fabric from this piece. So towards the center, you're sewing a lot of layers. And this one we're going to be starting on the inside. And be careful not to pull at any of these things as you go. And when you start there in the inside, go really slow and maybe assist your fabric just a little bit. Don't tug it or pull it, because you'll pull it out of alignment. Okay, so we've got that one on. take our pins out and check that out. Okay, so we got that sewn on. Now, when you're sewing, I have stopped here at the seam, but you can go all the way up. And then when you're pressing, what you want to do is make sure that you press that extra line under, so when you are sewing it on the fabric and looking at your design, you will see that it lays nice and flat and it's straight, and you've got a finished seam there. Okay, look at there. That's looking good. Now this middle piece, we've got one side folding in and we've got one side folding out. So I'll go over that one more time in just a minute. So now we're ready to connect them up, and we're just going to connect them up the same way. 1 inch, 1 inch. It kind of lined itself up there, which is a good issue to have. Okay, I'm just going to sew that really quickly. And again, we're starting from the middle. I don't quite know why that happens so often. I think it's because of the direction we're sewing in. If you planned accordingly, you could sew the other way, so they were all starting on the outside. Okay, so that should be our final seam. Let's see how this is coming out. And don't be afraid if you have one that needs to be redone. Just rip it out and do it again. Okay, we're going to sew this one. Sew it. We're going to press it down. Press that in right there. And then this one. Let's see. Usually they go one way and then the other. But we're going to go ahead and do that one this way too. I think it'll just be easier. Okay, so you'll notice all these are folded in to give us a finished seam all the way around. We've got some stray threads and we'll fix those. Now, right before I started today, I did trim out just a little bit of excess here in the middle, just to so it would kind of lay flat. And I'm going to do that on those new pieces that we just sewed in. And you want to be kind of stingy about what you cut off, because you don't want to get it too big. The bigger you get it, the bigger that centerpiece is going to have to be. Okay, so we've got a little extra fabric in here, but it does lay flat. All right. Whoops, we've got, oh, it's just folded under. Oh, good. Thought we had a problem there. Now, how are we going to finish it? A lot of the ones I saw just put a circle in it, just like our regular Dresden plate. But I got to thinking, this is a 6-pointed snowflake. And what else is 6-pointed? A hexagon. So I created a hexagon EPP piece with the same fabric as my larger blade, and it should sit right there with the point of that. Whoops, I moved it. And it does. We can adjust that so that the point of the hexagon points right into that lighter color blade. And that's going to be our snowflake. Now, I will tell you, this went together pretty quickly, and we added 4 pieces into this. There are 24 pieces total. It's a lot of pieces to get together, and you have to be mindful that you're putting the right pieces together with the seam on the right side. But a little trial and error, and like I said, when you start, if you sew it, you can just slip it to another place and add pieces as you need to. When you get to the end, you've got to have them lined up correctly or they're not going to work. But that's our snowflake, and I think we're just going to set this on our square that we have, just in the center of it, and just let it be its own glory, its own design. It is quite pretty, in my opinion. The snowflake is just a little over, well, it's probably, not quite 12 and a half, about 12 and a quarter from tip of the white to tip of the white. And that's going to be the widest one. Now, if you were so inclined, and I see no reason why it couldn't be done, instead of having, where did my little piece go to? Instead of having your biggest piece at 6.5 inches, why not have your biggest piece at 24 inches or 12 inches or 18 inches? This ruler is 18 inches. Can you imagine a 36-inch snowflake? Well, I can. I think it would be just cute as can be. And if you take and you make a snowflake that big, you're not really dealing with anything different than what we dealt with here. You may need a little bit of assistance when you're pressing the end of these pieces where they don't sew to anything to keep that down. So you may need to either tack it in place, a little bit of applique glue. I would go real light on that applique glue, or even just a basting stitch to hold it down, something until you can get it placed. And then you can applique that on a huge block. Now let's think about this. This is about 32 inches inside diameter of this frame. You could do a, well, let's say 15. Let's say a 15-inch snowflake using this method would cover this whole thing. And you could use that for the center of a large winter quilt. And then follow up with a border of smaller snowflakes around the edges. And you could mix this up a bit. Let's say that you wanted to change this, and instead of having the longest one, the medium, and then the shorter ones, kind of in a pyramid shape, you did a longer one, you did the shorter ones, and then did the middle ones. So it would have a little bit of a different look, and you could kind of switch that up a bit, especially the ones that went around the outside. I think this is a great jumping point off into something even more creative if you're interested. Or you could set it up with just a border of squares set on point would be cute as well. So many possibilities. But I think the fabrics in this turned out really, really nice. It certainly is very cooling feeling and looks like a snowflake. Okay, so that's going to do it for our little portion of our video right now. I am going to place this on our 15-inch square, right smack dab in the center. I'm not going to adjust it to the side or anything. You could choose to do that. You could choose to do two, maybe different sizes, and put it in there if you wanted something a little fuller. But as I said in the beginning, our block of the month is just something that's kind of teaching us some techniques and putting together some ideas about what's special about that month, the things that we're recognizing or celebrating. And it serves as a jumping off point for other creative ideas that we might have. So I'm just going to do it just like that. Hi, I'm back with the finished product of our quilt block for January. And isn't she pretty? I'm going to call her a girl even though she's in blue because she's just so pretty with those dainty little flowers and the little hearts. I love it. I love blue. Blue is one of my favorite colors. And the way this turned out, I am just delighted. So I mentioned earlier in the video that I found something that looks similar to this on the web as a block that someone had designed. And that person's name was Brenda Sutter. And I saved that picture. Actually, I wrote down her name and then went back and looked at it and then saved her picture as my inspiration for this, not knowing at the time that there was actually a pattern for this. So I probably could have saved myself a lot of time and trouble had I ordered the pattern, but I didn't know it existed at the time. But if you're interested and you don't want to do all this math, it is out there. And again, her name is Brenda Sutter. Brenda Sutter, S-U-T-T-E-R, and it's called the Midnight Snowfall Dresden Snowflake Quilt Block. And it was featured in a magazine. I don't have the name of that magazine handy, but I think if you look up her name and the name of the block, it might take you to it. It looks like one of the only things that I've changed. I've changed the layout of the deepness in the patterns and colors a bit. And it also looks like she used a circle in the middle of hers, whereas I used the hexagon, and that was a 1-inch hexagon in this size. Now, one thing I don't know is how big her blades are, and mine could be completely different size. I really don't know. But mine were 6.5, 5.5, and 4.5 cut, and then once you sew it, they adjust a little bit. But that's the block. I am just tickled to pink over it, and I think that I haven't decided. You know, when I was doing it, I was thinking I was going to make a pillow out of it, a pillow cover. And the more I look at it, the more I'm just really intrigued with it. And I think that maybe I will take and add some borders and maybe a decorative border around it to make something larger, but I haven't decided. And that's the beauty of doing these blocks, because what we think we might have at the end may not be what we have at the end. So it's a good, again, learning opportunity to learn something, to be able to actually see it in fabric in front of us to decide how we want to use it. Now, just very quickly, I only used 3 colored patterned fabrics for this and the actual background of the block. I used the 3 pieces of pattern, and again, you could go to Brenda's site or the magazine site and pick up the pattern if you want to use hers, or you can do the math and come up with this, and then the 1 EPP 1-inch hexagon for the center. It's all 1/4-inch seams. I didn't really have that much adjusting to do. I think there was 1 piece I had to adjust to get it to lay flat. And I don't know whether that was actually that it needed to be adjusted, or when I sewed it, I just let the fabric stretch a little bit. Could have been the problem. But I just really love it. Don't you love it? It's so pretty. Now, another thing. It was sewn on here with just the regular, like invisible stitch that we would use to put binding on, or you might use to hem a pair of pants, or to stitch something on that you don't want to see that seam. So I just used a kind of light blue around it, and that blended very well with the colors we have. The one thing I want to point out to you is that it's amazing to me how you can take a pattern, the Dresden plate pattern, and not only can you create something like this where you've just adjusted the size of the blades and position them in a way that the colors really make that light fabric pop out at you, and that's what makes it look like a snowflake, versus where you take it and you combine it with really modern, in-your-face colors to come up with something like this. Or you could use subtle pastel colors to come up with a Dresden plate quilt that your grandmother might have made. Now, I'm a grandmother too, so don't take that as an insult by any means. But you know what I mean? Some of the older quilts, 50, 60 years ago, were made pastel. They were very feminine, they were very soft and gentle, and that's kind of, when I think about Dresden plate, that's what I immediately go to think of. But step back and think about the shapes, and then add your colors in, or add your little changes, like where we did this and we put the point in with the rounded tops. Either way, this was a perfect fit for the pointy tips because it added that crystalline structure that a snowflake would have. I just love it. It's just great. So pretty. So pretty. Okay, so this wraps up our Block of the Month project for 2024. And as I mentioned before, we will not do one of these in 2025. I have another project that I'm kind of begun working on that we're going to see if we can't make work as an ongoing project in 2025. And something that will not rely on me to come up with designs and patterns and so forth. We're going to use standard patterns that are already out there to complete that. But more information on that later. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with this beautiful block. I hope you've enjoyed this video as well as this entire project. If you would, please give me a thumbs up to show that you like the video. Be sure to subscribe, share us with a friend, and we'll see you next week at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Bye.